Hello, everyone. Dr. Jason Silva here, and today we're going to be discussing the 5 goals of punishment. These are sometimes referred to as the 5 purposes of punishment, and we're essentially trying to capture our reasoning for engaging in punishment within the United States. When we think about why we punish, we need to think about who benefits. And within the 5 goals of punishment, we think about the benefits being attributed to the victim, the offender, or society. Now, the 5 goals of punishment include retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and restorative justice. With that in mind, we're now going to use a high-profile crime as a frame of reference in order to have a greater understanding of these 5 goals. The high-profile crime we're going to discuss today includes Bernie Madoff, arguably the most infamous white-collar criminal in the contemporary United States. Bernie Madoff engaged in a Ponzi scheme that defrauded his clients out of billions of dollars, and he was eventually sentenced to 150 years of prison. Given that context, let's suss through the 5 goals of punishment, explaining each, who benefits, and how it applies within this instance. The first goal of punishment is retribution. In other words, those who infringe on the rights of others deserve punishment. This is rooted in Hammurabi's Code, and here you see me standing in front of Hammurabi's Code in the Louvre in Paris, France. Hammurabi's Code is arguably the earliest law of the land, and taken together, it essentially means that punishment should be eye for an eye. In other words, if you commit a certain crime, you deserve an equal punishment. This is what we refer to as just deserts. Now, in the case of eye for an eye, it becomes difficult with Bernie Madoff because since he stole lots of money, what would an equal punishment to that be in terms of incarceration or prison sentencing? For example, it would be easier if we had a case like a murder. With a murder, we can make an argument that eye for an eye would be killing the individual who murdered. In other words, they would then receive the death sentence. And while there are many issues with that, that is essentially the simplest way to understand it. But going back to Bernie Madoff, he has stolen billions of dollars, and we believe that the fair retribution or equal rate of punishment for his crime, the just deserts he deserved, was a 150-year prison sentence. Who benefits from this? Well, we need to consider that the victims are predominantly benefiting when it comes to eye for an eye. They want retribution for the actions that were done to them. This will give them a sense of fulfillment, arguably, and hopefully make them feel better about their victimization. Now, the second goal of punishment is deterrence, and this refers to the prevention of future crime. With that in mind, there are 2 types of deterrence, specific and general. Specific deterrence is meant to prevent the specific offender from engaging in future crime. In other words, by incarcerating Bernie Madoff, we are preventing them from engaging in more Ponzi schemes. Alternatively, general deterrence is meant to deter the rest of society from engaging in future crimes. So the specific offender is made an example of. This example is then spread around the community, and offenders who were potentially interested in engaging in a similar crime may be deterred from engaging in said crime because they heard about the punishment that someone else received. For example, in the United States, we once hung individuals in a public square. We could say that this is a form of retribution. So, for example, if they murdered someone, we then hung them. In addition, it's a form of general deterrence. In other words, people would come and watch this public hanging, and they would then potentially be deterred from engaging in future crime because they saw what would happen if they were to get caught. When we consider who benefits from this, it's largely beneficial to society. In other words, we're deterring specific individuals from engaging in future crime, which would thereby threaten society. We're also deterring other potential criminals from engaging in future crime, thereby again preventing general societal crime. The third goal of punishment is incapacitation. Incapacitation is largely referring to incarceration. In other words, we put someone away who is a threat to society, thereby preventing future crimes against individuals within that society. With Bernie Madoff, we could say that he was potentially going to continue engaging in Ponzi schemes, thereby threatening society. And we are now denying the offender the ability to engage in future crimes. Now, when we think about who benefits in the instance of incapacitation, we could think both the victim and society. The reason for the victim being, if the individual is incapacitated, then we could say that that is a form of retribution. In addition, society benefits because this individual is no longer a threat to the outside world. The fourth goal of punishment is rehabilitation, and this prevents future crime by altering offenders' behaviors. So let's use an example of a drug user who robs a home, but he is largely robbing that home in order to pay for his drug addiction. If we rehabilitate that offender, in other words, they receive some sort of treatment either within the prison system or outside of the prison system for their drug addiction, such as AA or NA, if we rehabilitate them, they were no longer going to engage in these types of behaviors. So when we think about who benefits from rehabilitation, it would be both the offender as well as society. In other words, the offender has now become better or rehabilitated, and society is no longer at risk because the offender is no longer a risk. With the case of Bernie Madoff, it becomes difficult to sort of conceptualize a form of rehabilitation. However, alternative forms of rehabilitation include educational training or vocational training, both of which help the offender become whole and allow them the opportunity to reintegrate back into society. 90% of offenders currently incarcerated within the United States will be released back into society at some point. This highlights the importance of rehabilitation because we do not want them to be a threat once they have been released, and we want them to have the social survival skills in order to avoid recidivism or returning back to prison. The fifth goal of punishment is restorative justice, and this is focused more on the wrongdoing than the actual crime committed. In other words, we're looking to ensure that all three parties are benefiting. This includes the offender, the victim, and society. Now, in the case of Bernie Madoff, a form of restorative justice could be restitution. In other words, paying a monetary fine. So in this example, we could say that Bernie Madoff then needs to pay for his actions, thereby benefiting the victims. Society is made whole because we are solving the problem that was initially engaged in. And finally, the offender realizes the wrongdoings of their actions by paying said restitution. There are many forms of restorative justice, not just restitution. Another example of restorative justice could be a dialogue between those victimized and the offender. So, for example, in the instance of a hate crime, if the victim of that hate crime is willing to speak with the offender, they may be able to engage in a dialogue that makes the offender recognize their wrongdoing, see that hate is wrong, and potentially change their ways. This, again, benefits all three parties. The offender realizes their wrongdoing and will no longer engage in those actions. The victim feels whole again because they recognize that the offender feels that they have done wrong. And finally, society is benefiting because the offender is no longer a risk of engaging in future potential crimes. This concludes our discussion of the 5 goals of punishment. However, just to remind you, they include retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and restoration. It's important to recognize that these punishments are not mutually exclusive, and oftentimes there's an overlap between them when engaging in our decision-making processes in terms of how to punish individuals. Thank you for watching, and please comment below if you have any questions or concerns about the 5 goals of punishment.